Hey guys. So today we are talking about what happened when those explorers reached the New World. Particularly, we're starting with Columbus and talking about the Columbian Exchange, and then we're going into what the triangle trade was and how that developed from the Columbian Exchange in the first place. And what I really want you to think about today is which one of these two things was actually worse. They're both terrible. Well, they both had terrible effects. There were also some good effects for some people, but which one of these do you think was the worst? Check them out. So the first one is the Columbian Exchange, and this diagram does a really good job of showing what that is, because it happened once Columbus reached the New World and came back with new things that people had never seen before. So the whole idea of the Columbian Exchange is you have these two totally different continents that are basically aliens to each other, and then suddenly, with the arrival of Columbus, they can go back and forth, and the things that are on each continent can exchange from one to the other. So this happened in the 1500s. This happened in the 1500s, right after Columbus came back. And when he went over with him, he brought a whole bunch of different things, not necessarily just on the first voyage, but afterwards, because he went back and back and he kept bringing things with him. So, for example, they brought coffees over to the Americas. They brought peaches and pears, all these different kinds of fruits. They brought horses. And one of the biggest things that we're going to talk about in a sec is they brought lots of different diseases too. And then when Columbus returned to Europe, he brought things like peanuts, potatoes, tomatoes, corn, beans, all these things that he's bringing back to Europe that suddenly now people are growing on the European continent. They're growing those kind of fruits and vegetables. And then in America, they're growing all those things that he brought over. So that's what the Columbian Exchange was. And it made it so now all of these things were on these different continents and they were connected and they became more similar. But one of the biggest negative effects was the diseases, and particularly smallpox. That's what this drawing is a depiction of. Smallpox is a disease you get when you come in contact with other people with smallpox, and you get these like big pustules. If you Google smallpox and click images, you'll see pictures of it that are really nasty. And then they burst, and there's all this like nasty stuff that comes out. And if that gets on you, then you get smallpox. And this had a terrible effect on the people in the New World, the Native Americans, because they had never had been in contact with this disease before. So what happened was, particularly because of the diseases, but also as a result of the wars and the slavery that the Europeans did to the Native Americans when they arrived, some people estimate that 95% of Native Americans died in the first 130 years post-Columbus. 95%. That means out of all the people in your class, if 95% of them died, there would really be like one, maybe one and a half left. So that's a lot of people that died. That also made it a lot easier for people like Pizarro and like Cortez to take over because they were fighting against populations that were really sick already and that had already lost a lot of their people. The second one is the triangle trade. And the triangle trade is the trade between the Americas, Europe, and Africa between the 16th and 19th century. And it's in the shape of a triangle. I'll show you what that triangle looks like in a second. One part of the triangle trade that was really famous and has its own name is called the Middle Passage. And the Middle Passage is the part in which slaves were transported from Africa to the Americas. Please get these vocabulary words down on your paper. So the triangle trade started around the time of Columbus, a little bit after that because they needed some time to get the goods moving and flowing. And it continued all the way into the 1700s. At the end of the 1700s, it kind of ended because the British outlawed the slave trade, so it made it a lot more difficult. But what it was people in Europe who had factories, they would manufacture goods. So those were things like glass and glass beads. There were things like cloth made out of cotton. It was things like guns or iron, anything that had to be manufactured or made. because they had factories in Europe that they didn't have in Africa. They would build them in Europe and then send them to Africa and sell them there and buy slaves from Africans. So oftentimes it was not the Europeans that went into the woods and captured people. It was Africans themselves who would go and capture other Africans and then sell them to the Europeans. Then they would get on slave ships and go across the Middle Passage to the Americas. And actually, the majority of slaves went to Brazil down here or South America. A lot of them went to the islands in the Caribbean, like Cuba and like Puerto Rico, and some of them ended up going to the United States. And so we're going to see kind of what that looked like in a minute. Then what would happen was in those places, the slaves would be used in agriculture, so either in producing cotton, producing sugar, producing tobacco, and then they would send those things back over to Europe, which had the money to pay for them. That was a triangle trade. And then with that money, they would make the manufactured goods, and it would go on and on and on. And a ship could start out here, bring manufactured goods down here, unload that, put on slaves, go this way, then unload those slaves and put on the raw materials and go back. And it could just keep going around for its whole life. So this is a drawing of what a slave ship looked like. And you could see they didn't even have space to stand up. People were forced in very close quarters. It was really disgusting. You can read people's accounts that they wrote about what it was like to be on a slave ship, and they would say there was no place to go to the bathroom. There was absolutely no privacy. People would get sick and would die and would stay there for a long time. Sometimes a third or a half of the people on the ship would die in the Middle Passage in just that 1 month. It could get really, really bad. And there were some ships where the slaves would mutiny and they would take over the ship and then sail it back to Africa. It did happen sometimes, but the majority of the time it didn't happen. So what I want you to think of was, which one do you think was worse, the Columbian Exchange or the Triangle Trade? So go to bit.ly/DTE worse and answer that for the class. It'll show up on the board when you're finished. Now answer some review questions to make sure you're ready for your exit ticket. And then just a review for our MLQ, which is on Thursday. Here's a couple questions to keep you on your toes.